Hello, I'm Lance Holbert, coming to you from the University of Pennsylvania, where I'm a research professor with the Annenberg School for Communication and director of the Leonore Annenberg Institute for Civics within the Annenberg Public Policy Center. It's a great honor to be here and be invited to the Communication the Millennium 2024 annual meeting. I'm sorry I can't be there in person. I have certain duties relative to the U.S. election, and our election day is bumping up against your annual meeting, and I've been asked to be able to stay here for a few extra days, given that you'll be consuming this talk after our election day, but prior to what I'm guessing will be the actual decision made on who won or lost that particular election, and I need to remain in the United States during that time. My talk today is entitled "Better Defining the Field of Communication." The reason for this particular talk is that it's in part a tribute to Max McCombs. So the connection that I'm having to your particular annual meeting is through Max. And I know that you'll, as a result of his untimely passing, will be celebrating the man and his work during your annual meeting. And I wanted to use this talk as well to offer my own tribute to Max. Max became a friend and a mentor to me over the last 15 years. You can see that we've written a book together, News and Public Opinion, Media Effects on Civic Life. It's difficult to put into words that the degree to which, his humility and his wit and his inquisitiveness, how much they will be missed. They already are, and I'm sure you're going to be talking about that a bit during your annual meeting. And so I wanted to use this particular talk and this particular topic is something that I think would strike his fancy. And so in part, the nature of this topic is a tribute to Max. And so I'm sure you'll celebrate him as well. So relative to how we define or understand the field of communication. So as I'm guessing you may be aware, the field of communication, its stature and its impact have continued to grow. So if we look at something like the number of journals that are listed within the Social Science Citation Index, the field of communication 20 years ago had 44 journals. In 2013, that increased by 30 up to 74. And now, as of the last set of ratings done by the JCR, we have 97. And so we've more than doubled over the last 20 years. And not just have we increased in terms of size, but also in terms of stature, the nature of the impact factors. Our ratings now are on par or even exceed several like-minded fields, such as political science. And in describing the field of communication today, I will oftentimes compare and contrast it with the field of political science, since Max was a political communication scholar, in choosing which field to kind of use as a reference point for the field of communication. I will oftentimes refer to political science, so I might as well begin there. So what is communications identity? All right, so this is a question that has been asked since the beginning of the field, so this is not a new question. Field of communication was born out of several different fields of study. You had folks that were asking communication questions out of political science, out of sociology, out of psychology, out of anthropology, out of English, and they would come together and find that they had like-minded interests, and out of that communication formed. And so as a result of us forming out of a number of pre-existing fields, there's always been this identity question of what is communication? How does it stand out? How is it doing anything unique relative to other fields of study? And I would say that this identity crisis that the field has had for the better part of 80, 90 years has oftentimes come with an inferiority complex that, as a result of being more of a fledgling field for several of those decades, it didn't have nearly the influence or the impact as these kind of pre-existing fields of study. But indeed, in terms of there's this kind of newly gained impact, this kind of imposter syndrome has left. So our field, we are kind of a standalone entity. And so putting that kind of inferiority complex behind, it's a new way or a new perspective taking that we have on still trying to address this old question of what is our identity. And so I wanted to use my brief time here today in speaking to you to try to offer up a new way to kind of look at that question. It doesn't necessarily answer that question, but it is a new perspective on how to begin to think about it in some way. So in terms of defining a field of study, stepping back from just communication, we need to isolate the unique value that communication has within this kind of competitive marketplace of other fields of study. And so there's different ways in which we can categorize a field of study. So one long-standing one, as an example, is to think about that there are fields of study that are focused on a single level of analysis. So psychology is focused on the individual level, all right, how the individual reacts cognitively to, let's say, messages or other stimuli in the environment, and how that shapes their thoughts and perceptions. Or sociology, which exists strictly at the macro social level. So you have those kind of single level fields of study. But then also you have what are defined as multiple levels fields of study. So a field like economics. So if you're an economics major, an economics student, you will take microeconomics, the focus on the individual. And you'll take macro level economics, which focuses on society. Or you have another field like political science is also dealing with multiple levels. So you have scholars that focus on individual level political behavior like voting. But you also have within political science institutionalists that are focusing on, within the United States, the executive branch or the legislative branch or the Supreme Court as institutions, not as individuals. And as a result, both of these fields deal with multiple levels of analysis. And while it's a weakness of all these fields that those who in economics focus on just the micro level or just the macro level, or political science, you have the individual behavioralists, or you have the institutionalists, rarely do they cross levels. And communication is clearly a between level field of study. We study everything from the individual level, both in terms of physiologically as well as psychologically, all the way up to the macro social in terms of like media institutions, and then nested in between that may be a media organization or some other communication entity at an organizational level. And by and large, most work in field of communication, any one researcher and program of study oftentimes deals with just one of those levels and rarely crosses them. And people have made that assertion for several decades now. But communication is like other fields of study in terms of dealing with multiple levels of analysis. So within that, the idea of dealing with multiple levels doesn't make communication unique. But what does? So I would like to offer here today the idea that there is an additional way or additional category by which we can define various fields of study. And the category I want to mention today is this distinction between what we'll define as a dependent variable field versus an independent variable field. And so For communication, rarely is communication the outcome, the dependent variable. For us as communication scholars, we're oftentimes looking at communication leading to a given set of outcomes. And so those given set of outcomes, those dependent variables, are oftentimes then owned by other fields of study. So if we study an attitudinal outcome, attitudes are owned by social psychology. Or if we look at a health behavior outcome, that is within the field of public health. If we look at a political behavior as an outcome, something like voting, then that is indeed owned by the field of political science. So this is part of the identity crisis, is that most fields of study, the way in which they brand themselves, the way they define themselves, is based on what are the outcomes that they are looking at. Whereas communication is most interested in that which leads to those outcomes. So if we compare something like communication to a field like political science, I'm arguing here today, is that is much more clearly defined as a dependent variable field, whereas communication is clearly much more of an independent variable field. They may study the same communication acts as a political communication scholar, and they may actually study the same dependent variables, but where they're coming from, how they define themselves, is very different in terms of which of those are the priority. And I'm going to argue that that's an important distinction. So if we look at political science as it begins with voting, right? It begins with the behavior, the political behavior of voting. And they'll say that, all right, that is what we're beginning with, and then let's look backward toward what was most important leading to that behavior. But they're beginning at the dependent variable and then looking backward at something like a communicative act or a series of communicative acts, whether it's news exposure or debate viewing or how much contact you had with various various types of political advertising, or your social media engagement, or whatever else it may be. But it begins with voting and then looking backward. Whereas communication scholars, even though they're going to look at voting as the outcome, begin with the communication dynamic. What are the different communication dynamics that are at work here? And beginning to understand those. And then one of the outcomes they can look at is something like voting. But the very fact that they're beginning by their perspective taking from the idea of let's look at the independent variables, the communication dynamics first, allows them to then think about the outcome. They have a very different perspective relative to a political scientist. And even though they're looking at the same communication acts and they're looking at the same political behavior of voting, all right, my belief is that, and working with several political scientists around similar phenomena, that different perspective, all right, of coming from the dependent variable and working backward, or beginning with the independent variable and looking forward, leads to very different types of knowledge. And so as a result of defining our field as an independent variable field and distinguishing it from dependent variable fields, then we can start to put into some perspective our unique value and our sense of how we brand ourselves as unique knowledge generators relative to other fields out there that on first glance look like they're studying the same things. So how does this distinction, what does this distinction afford the field? I'm going to argue that there's really four things that could come from this. One, it allows communication to distinguish itself from other like-minded fields, even those fields that deal with multiple levels of analysis. All right. So as a result, there is this kind of unique value, and even recognizing that there is value in being an independent variable field relative to a dependent variable field will allow communication to begin to make an argument that its type of knowledge, all right, is unique in value relative to other fields. Two, and I think this would be more of a challenge, is that by establishing ourselves as an independent variable field, we can begin to reevaluate how we organize the field itself. So if we look at our major associations, our academic and scholarly associations, the way in which we establish divisions within those associations are based around context, right? So most major associations within communication, scholarly associations, have, as an example, a political communication division, or they have a health communication division. And those are defined by and large by context of politics and health, and around the nature of the dependent variables that establish are in terms of a political outcome or a health outcome. Whereas scholars who work in those particular subfields, the way in which they study, as an example, a political campaign versus a health campaign is 90% similar in terms of the nature of the communication processes and how they unfold, of how media works in combination with interpersonal, which works in combination with mediated interpersonal social media dynamics, as an example. How that plays itself out in a political context, those communication processes, versus a health context, is very similar. And people that work in these areas know that. Yet we've separated ourselves into political communication or health communication based largely on the way in which other fields of study have defined themselves, not how we have defined ourselves. So if we begin to think about how we define ourselves in terms of different scholars that are studying similar communicative acts or similar communication processes, then our associations may look very different in terms of where we establish like-minded interests. So I would argue that the way in which our scholarly associations are structured as an operationalization of how we see the field is creating oftentimes artificial distinctions, all right? Artificial distinctions between a division like health communication and political communication is defined largely by the way in which other fields of study may be looking at us, not how we should try to define ourselves. And if we can make more salient this notion of that we're an independent variable field, then maybe we can begin to be defined more by the communicative acts that we're looking at, the communication processes that we have an interest in, rather than the outcomes that are owned by other fields of study and the way that they brand themselves. This is part of the nature of the identity crisis. Third is that I would argue that if we begin to understand communication as an independent variable field, it may lead more to the study of communication to communication dynamics. And I've worked with Nathan Walter at Northwestern University and a whole range of different scholars around building around this idea of establishing different scientific principles for the field of communication. And one of the principles that we have is what we've articulated is what is called the Chaffee principle. So Stephen Chaffee, longtime scholar, University of Wisconsin, Stanford, and University of California, Santa Barbara, a lot of his work as an example of political sociology, focused on this idea of communication to communication dynamics, on how, let's say, consuming a debate, let's say between a parent and a child, will then lead to a discussion of that debate. And that as communication scholars, we should be deeply interested in those communication to communication dynamics. So Stephen Chafee would approach something like the study of a political campaign by saying a political campaign is nothing more than a very large communication experiment. You have a whole bunch of people communicating around a single thing. And we want to understand those communication processes and those communication dynamics. And oftentimes when you study those communication processes and those dynamics of, as an example I just gave of how debate viewing can lead to discussion, then the outcomes can range from anything from an agenda setting outcome of what issues become more salient to you. An outcome could be political knowledge. How much do you know about those issues or the major candidates running for an elected office? What are your attitudes toward those candidates? And indeed, it could also affect something like political behavior, who you're going to vote for. Whereas a political scientist may begin with any of those dependent variables and look backward and say, what was the predictive value of debate viewing predicting voting? Or what was the predictive value of political discussion affecting voting? They're going to ask those questions where those communicative acts, discussion and debate viewing, are treated as almost in competition with one another in terms of producing variance or predictive value relative to an outcome like voting. That's very different than how a communication scholar should look at it. A communication scholar would say, this is a large communication experiment creating these communication to communication dynamics, and that those communication to communication dynamics could affect a range of political outcomes across the hierarchy of effects from salience, like an agenda setting effect, all the way to a political behavior like a voting outcome. So if we better embrace this notion that we're an independent variable field, I think that would naturally lead to studying something like the Chafee principle more, which is that the idea of communication to communication processes are important in and of themselves. And there's value in that in the sense of the meta-analytic work that we've done on the communication to communication dynamics that have been studied to date show that the effect sizes of those processes are greater than other types of communication outcomes. And so the idea of beginning to study those communication to communication dynamics all of a sudden starts to lift the nature of the effect sizes that communication can identify. But I would argue that really only communication is well situated to be able to make the argument for the value of something like communication to communication. And as Chafee stated, the most likely effect of communication is more communication. And what we've been able to uncover to date is that the field of communication doesn't study what Chafee has identified as the most likely effect of communication. There's a lot more work that needs to be done there, but we're only going to be able to do that in a larger scale if we start to embrace the value of what we are as an independent variable field of study. And then number 4, and this may seem counterintuitive or actually even running a little bit against my argument, is that we could actually begin to see communication become a dependent variable in more studies. So building off the previous point of if we are able to show that there's value in studying communication to communication effects, and that we can look at those communication to communication processes relative to attitudinal outcomes in advertising, or behavioral outcomes in health communication, or political outcomes, behavioral outcomes in political communication, and just expand those processes that we're already studying, then it could actually naturally lead to, well, if we understand that communication to communication matters, then it could be the case that there's an argument to be made that studying on its own how one communicative act as an independent variable leads to another communicative act as a dependent variable isn't in itself enough for study. That we don't have to extend it out to those other outcomes that are owned by other fields. Communication itself can be a dependent variable, but we're actually only going to increase the level of that work, the amount of that work, if we first acknowledge that we are an independent variable field. So the idea of the example I used before relative to political socialization, yes, we can study the idea of how debate viewing leads to political discussion, and that then leads to a voting outcome. But also, if we find that communication to communication process has value, then indeed it seems worthwhile to study on its own the real intricacies and nuances of how debate viewing leads to discussion, where discussion is where the study ends. Discussion, political talk, political discussion is itself the dependent variable. So over time, it could be the idea that once we acknowledge the field of communication is an independent variable field of study, one outcome of that could actually be that communication becomes more of a dependent variable in our work. And once again, that seems counterintuitive, but that could be the natural progression of things. But the combination of all of these things, the idea that it allows us to, the idea of defining ourselves as an independent variable field of study distinguishes us from other fields, that it allows us to reevaluate how we organize ourselves around what is our principal interests, that we then begin to study communication to communication dynamics, which are of clear empirical value, but are only going to be really driven by communication scholars, and that communication becomes a dependent variable, then we start to see all the more that communication has found its true identity, that it's able to make a stronger argument for how it is a unique field of study that comes from a unique perspective, asking unique questions, and out of a unique perspective and unique questions, you get unique new knowledge. And that is ultimately, at the end of the day, what a field of study is, how its knowledge is of value and also unique relative to all the other different fields of study that are out there, looking at a whole range of phenomena. And so, closing today, the idea of beginning to reimagine, rethink how we look at the field of communication, I would encourage all of you and all of us to, across the field, to begin to consider communication as an independent variable field. Thank you. And once again, and best wishes for the rest of your association meeting. And we'll see how the election outcomes, it turns out here in the United States. But thank you very much.